Mic is on. Welcome to Remember When, a podcast about the moments that made us. In the mid-90s, as South Africa was taking its first uncertain steps into democracy, Hollywood came knocking. And not once or twice, but many times. Two films about Nelson Mandela were in the works. One was based on his best-selling autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom, a years-long passion project backed by South African producer Anand Singh, and personally blessed by Mandela himself. The other was a made-for-TV drama which was produced by Showtime in the US, originally titled One Man, One Vote. The story goes that its producer, Bernard Sofronsky, had initially tried to get the rights to Long Walk to Freedom but was unsuccessful, and decided he still wanted to tell Mandela's story. Thus, this film was conceived. It starred Sidney Poitier as Mandela and Michael Caine as F.W. De Klerk. But unlike Singh's film, it had no official endorsement, and from the start, it faced resistance. Local actors' unions objected to foreign casting. Government access to film in parliament and prisons was denied. Mandela hadn't seen the script, hadn't offered approval, and deliberately kept his distance while filming took place in Cape Town. Behind the scenes, it was awkward, especially when Mandela was quietly meeting Sidney Poitier just before filming began. The two had apparently struck up a friendship. And yet, this Showtime film, later retitled Mandela and De Klerk, made it to the screens first. It offered a dramatized look at the private negotiations that ended apartheid, the Nobel Prize-winning partnership that never quite became a friendship, and the transition of power between two vastly different men. Today, I'm joined by screenwriter of that film, Richard Wesley, to talk about writing political drama in real time, the friction of authorship, and what it means to tell the story of Nelson Mandela when the man himself isn't part of the production. This is Remember When, and we're asking, who gets to write the legacy? Richard is a New Jersey native who graduated from Howard University in 1967. From Broadway stages to Hollywood screens, his work has explored the Black experience with depth and brilliance and has earned him multiple awards across film, theater, and television. He's also a professor at NYU's Tisch School of the Arts. Richard wrote the screenplay for Mandela and De Klerk, the 1997 English and Afrikaans language drama film that's directed by Joseph Sargent. It was nominated for 2 awards, a Screen Actors Guild Award nomination for Outstanding Performance by a Male Actor in a TV Movie or Miniseries for Sidney Poitier, and a Golden Globe nomination for Best Performance by an Actor in a Supporting Role in a Series, Miniseries, or Motion Picture Made for Television for Michael Caine. Richard, welcome to Remember When.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure being here.
Thank you for making the time. What made you say yes to telling the story of Nelson Mandela and F.W. de Klerk? I mean, it's a story that has captured the world for decades and decades.
I said yes immediately when I was asked. The struggle in South Africa for freedom and justice is a struggle that had long been a part of every conversation, from the most politicized of Black people to even the least politicized. The struggle against apartheid was a mirror image in many ways of the struggle for civil rights here in the United States. The old Union of South Africa modeled its policies of apartheid on the principles of Jim Crow laws or segregation laws that we had here in the U.S. for years, from a Supreme Court decision in 1898, which more or less codified it and made it national law. Right up until we managed to secure the Civil Rights Bill of 1965, which overturned Jim Crow. So the struggle against apartheid was something that we were very much aware of. The Sharpsville massacre was covered extensively within the Black press here in the United States. Nelson Mandela's trial was something that we were very much aware of. And of course, during his imprisonment, Winnie Mandela became an international figure of resistance, and her struggles was something that was very well known to us. So when the opportunity presented itself for me to write a television motion picture script for it, to tell part of that story, the part at that time, it was not the full scope of President Mandela's imprisonment. It was just the negotiation, that direct negotiation between him and the ANC on one side and F.W. de Klerk and the apartheid regime on the other, which led to the dissolution of what was then the Union of South Africa and the elections that brought about the South Africa that we know today. So it was going to be a very narrow focus. And that was a story that I was very much interested in being a part of telling. So there was no hesitation on my part once the offer was made to me. And, I had a chance, of course, to work again with Sidney Poitier. That was, I think, maybe our fourth or fifth project.
Yeah, you had worked together quite a few times, actually.
Yes.
Not many people can say that.
It's true. I feel very fortunate about that. This would have, Mandela and De Klerk was the first time that we would work together on a project that we did not initiate. That was a big difference, but we were eager to do it. There had been discussions earlier about doing a motion picture in the States on the life of Nelson Mandela. I remember Sidney's good friend, Harry Belafonte, had been trying for several years at that point to pull together the resources that he would need or felt that he needed in order to do such a project. And if I recall, I think even by 1997, there had been representations of Nelson Mandela on screen in Hollywood projects. I'll have to look that up. It's been almost 30 years. But I know Morgan Freeman, the actor Morgan Freeman, had played Nelson Mandela in a project, and there was another actor as well. So I'm not sure that Sidney was actually the first. And then Steve Biko, another great hero, he was portrayed on screen a few years earlier by Denzel Washington. So there was a lot of interest and work being done here in the U.S. Around some of the great figures in the struggle in South Africa. And the Mandela and De Klerk negotiations was of major interest because of the impact that it had, I think, on continental African history.
Yeah. Now, so I mean, we'll touch on that a bit later on. But I wanted to know then, because you did say that the period that you were focused on when you started to write the screenplay was quite narrow. I wanted to touch on how much free reign did you have in terms of your research process. Take me through that process of putting together the first draft right to the final draft and what we saw on screen.
Boy, yes. Well, the initial meetings all surrounded his incarcerations at Pollsmoor. Or was it Victor? At Pollsmoor. The story should encompass the pressures that were on the South African government, both internally and externally. P.W. Botha was the president at that time, and he was a very intransigent and difficult figure. So we would start with him, and the history that or information that was given was that F.W. de Klerk was one of his ministers. He was in the Botha cabinet at the time. And with the resistance, no, I'm not going to pronounce it correct, but I'll stay with the youth movement.
Yeah.
Because it was, as I recall at the time, it was driven by the youth. It was the youth who were in the streets. And the images that were coming back here to the States from that were inspiring. And also brought back memories of the youth marches in the American South during our struggle against segregation. So we were going to start there because that was a political situation that could resonate very easily with U.S. audiences here. And because of the brutality of the response to the youth protests, that led to international reaction, including demonstrations and expressions of protest here in the United States against the government, against the policy of apartheid. So we were going to start the script there and show how that international pressure led, combined with the internal pressure, combined with the continuing active militant resistance by the ANC, all of these things would start pushing down on the apartheid government. I don't remember all the details, but I remember that Botha ultimately was driven from office, forced to resign, and F.W. de Klerk came in. And when de Klerk came in, along with him came other ministers who were now prepared to find some kind of way to ameliorate the situation, calm things down, maybe create some sort of coalition government, do something that would remove the pariah state designation that South Africa had at the time. And that meant they were going to have to speak to Nelson Mandela. He had, over the time, grown in reputation and stature during his imprisonment. One of the things I learned, of course, was that the apartheid government had been talking with him throughout his imprisonment about terms of release. There was a big fear that he might die while in prison. And at that point, he would become a martyr, which would make him even bigger, grander,
That pressure,
and greater than he had been while he was a prisoner, whether it was Robben Island or Victor Verstead or Posmo. So there was a certain desperation, and the script that I was writing was supposed to capture that desperation, that need for negotiation, and then convincing Nelson Mandela to actually talk to them, something that he was not prepared to do at first unless he got some kind of input from Oliver Tambo and other major figures inside the ANC. He was not going to speak just for himself. F.W. de Klerk would have to recognize that Nelson Mandela was also speaking for the ANC. And for that to happen, the government would have to recognize the ANC as a legitimate negotiating partner in this, which was something they had, they were loath to do, but they had to do it if they wanted to move ahead. As I started gathering all of that information, and at the earliest stages of writing the script, I was restricted in terms of research material. I was restricted to only using information from the public domain. I could not use any material that was copywritten or copyrighted, rather. That meant, no published memoirs, journalistic articles or information that might be gleaned from newscasts or anything that was under copyright, I could not use. But anything that was in the public domain, any information that I could get from there, I could use that. So initially, that was what I was doing. It was articles that were published in newspapers, both here in the U.S. And we got
because, of course, the Mandela autobiography had been released a couple of years
earlier. It had been published. Initially, I was told, "You will not use it. Do not go near it." I couldn't use that.
But were you aware that there was a bidding war from production companies all over the world who were trying to secure rights to the autobiography? I'm assuming that was connected to that.
At the time, I was not aware.
Okay.
I remember the young vice president at Showtime tell the cable network back here that produced the movie. All she would tell me was, "Do not go near it. Don't touch it." She was adamant about that. I decided, okay, I will just concentrate on public domain material. Unbeknownst to me, this bidding war that you were talking about was going on behind the scenes. And so I think in order for everyone, especially at Showtime, stay within legal bounds, it was absolutely imperative that I not lose any of that copyrighted material, that none of it would get into my script. So they kept me away from it. But what happened eventually was Showtime acquired the rights. Not only there was a book by a South African journalist, but anyway, he had written a book that Showtime did acquire the rights to. And his book was really quite well done. It was a lot of behind the scenes material and everything. And I believe it was his book that spent at least a chapter talking about the evolution of de Klerk's political consciousness and how he began to change, and a particular sermon that he heard in the Dutch Reformed Church that he went to that started to change his mind about what was going on. So that was a great scene, and I remember, writing it out and including it. But I think there was budget and some other considerations. They told me I had to cut it. But it opened, what it did was it opened me up to thinking about how I could shape De Klerk's character. Sparks' book also spent a great deal of time talking about Nelson Mandela before the negotiations, before his imprisonment, and Nelson Mandela, the young man. That book was very, very helpful to me.
Do you
Then
remember
there
any,
was a
like, if there was any surprising facts that you learned when you were reading? And actually, the journalist you're speaking of is Alistair Sparks. I don't know why I'm thinking of
Alice,
Nicholas Sparks.
Alistair Sparks. Yes, 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 yes.
So
It was
yes, Alistair
Alistair
Sparks. Did you,
Sparks.
when you were reading some of the stuff in his book and his writings, were there any details that surprised you or new things that you learned?
Well, yes, because it was in his book that I learned for the first time, because it wasn't, I must say, it wasn't really reported that much here in the United States or covered that much here in the United States. I learned the details of the trial in which Mandela and the other, I think there were 7 prisoners altogether, as I recall, the charges against them and how they were held in the jail at the courthouse in Cape Town. They were held until about midnight and then secretly loaded onto trucks, or a truck rather, and driven to the dockside and taken to Robben Island by boat after dark so that no one would see them. Also, and I think the thing that struck me, I knew growing up that Nelson Mandela had been a lawyer. And I think I knew from some photographs that at one time he had been interested in being a boxer. And there's the famous photograph of him in his training kit and everything. But I never knew that he was the son of royalty. I never knew that. I never knew that his family had come from a tradition of being advisors to the king. And that was revelation to me, because then it told me this is the source of his strength. This is the source of his discipline. It wasn't something that he acquired just through the cauldron of the struggle during his adulthood. This was something he was born into, and that he'd been taught. And so he had this well of strength, moral, mental, and even physical strength that he could draw from, that sustained him across those nearly 30 years that he was in prison. So that was something new, revelation for me. And I believe I learned more about his first marriage, the wife before, Elizabeth, I think her name was, the first wife.
The first wife was Evelyn. I remember Evelyn.
Evelyn. I know I remember that it began with an E.
Yes, Evelyn.
But I learned about that from some of Sparks' book, but also from another book that Showtime acquired the rights to. Getting back to your original question about the process, having those books that the network did acquire the rights to gave me so much background, and them as well, that the scope of the story began to expand. The executives at Showtime agreed with me that it would be impossible to just talk about the negotiation without talking about his incarceration, without talking about the tremendous change that he had undergone, as well as the country as a whole, because all of that played a role in what, ultimately led to that first meeting between De Klerk and Nelson Mandela.
So how many versions if you remember this, how many versions did you
I
even go
remember
through?
2 or 3. There was, and most of it was just a process of paring the script down from things that they felt were either too graphic. The second time I had to pare it down happened because when we were ready to go to South Africa to begin the filming, or I should say when they were ready to go, I did not come. I did come. I was there for a month, but then I was sent home just before production began. Actual shooting began.
Why was that?
I was teaching at that time. I had just begun. I think I was in my 2nd or 3rd year teaching at New York University at the time. In order for me to come to South Africa, I had to take a leave from my teaching because they needed me to do some work, some last minute work on the script. And so I was in Cape Town, I think for maybe a month. And then the chair of the department called and said, "You have to come home. You know, you do have a responsibility to the department and you have to return." By that time, I had finished the work on the script, but, they were going to let me stay for the entire shoot. So the day that I left to come back to the U.S. was the day that Sidney and Michael Caine and some of the other foreign actors arrived. I was there with the producer and the director, and for a very brief time, the vice president of production at Showtime. She flew over from Los Angeles. So we were all together during the preliminaries, which was important for me, especially. I do recall I visited all three prisons where the President Mandela had been incarcerated. Needless to say, the most difficult one was Robben Island for me. The other two, Victor Verster and Pollsmoor, especially that cottage that he was staying in Pollsmoor, he was living better. Even some Afrikaners there. It was a perfect example of the gilded cage experience. But the Robben Island prison complex that I saw and the cell and the that whole section where the cells were, they were relatively unchanged at that time from when President Mandela had been imprisoned there. So his cell looked very much like it did back in 1959 and in the 1960s. When he was there, I remember there was no glass on the window the way it is now. I think when the tourists go, they and I've seen it. I remember another trip to South Africa. I visited some of these same sites and everything was different because now it's been sort of cleaned up for the tourists, but it wasn't when I was there. So that was difficult for me, imagining and to some degree experiencing some of what he had to endure. Joe Sargent, the director, and I, and Sidney's producing partner, Cedric Scott, the three of us followed the same route. We just needed the experience. We needed to understand it. We were at the courthouse. We left the courthouse, rode out to the dock that he left from. The big difference was we took a helicopter from Cape Town to the old airstrip that's on Robben Island. So we didn't go by a ferry or anything like that.
Yeah.
When we were at the airport or runway, we walked along the same trail or a similar trail to what Nelson Mandela and Walter Sisulu and Kathrada and some of the others, the same path that they had to walk. We walked through the same processing area that they were in when they were processed into Robben Island. And then I remember we went to these large doors that slid apart and walked through it into a small hallway and eventually the cells. So I was in Mandela's cell. So the script was influenced by all of those experiences, my personal experiences from the readings, as well as my personal experiences from actually having been in South Africa and at some of those locations. The final version of the script, most of which you see on the screen now, took the shape that it did, because when we went to Africa, the divorce hearings between Winnie and Nelson Mandela were in their final stages. And there were all those lurid headlines that were in the press at the time having to do with the state of the marriage, what was going on, Winnie's affairs, and Stompy's death, the boy who was killed, allegedly at Winnie's direction and everything. And Showtime felt that let's remove as much of Winnie Mandela from the script as we can. She's way too controversial. And so pages started coming out, pages and pages.
You must have had sleepless nights.
Yes, I did. I felt, I felt that this story was being denuded in a way. I think in today's world, a lot of the material that was taken out would have been left in. It would not have been a television movie or 2-hour film. It probably would have been a 4-part miniseries, which I think in future iterations, if one is going to talk about those years and talk about the incredible complications that surrounded the lives of all the major players, it would have to be a miniseries. We never got, in my script, we never really got to cover Oliver Tambo. And, I knew from the day that I began writing that if you're going to talk about Nelson Mandela and you're going to talk about those years, from the late 1950s all the way up to Inauguration Day, when Nelson Mandela became president, you have to talk about Oliver Tambo. He has to be included. And I think in the final analysis, or in the final version of the script and the film that many people have seen, the only mention, I think Tambo is mentioned only twice. And one of those times was Sidney Poitier as Nelson Mandela standing at Oliver Tambo's grave. So unless you know something about the history, the significance of that moment is elusive. So that is a regret that I have, that material is sitting in a storage that I have included among some of the excess pages that I had to leave out of the final version of the script.
You talked about the month-long time that you spent down there with the director. Can you recall what that was like? Was there any resistance or was there any animosity towards the crew and the cast?
At the
or
time
suspicion, maybe.
At the time that I was there, not a great deal. Crews were still being pulled together. I do recall that the negotiations for access to Parliament, to be able to actually film inside Parliament, that was, they were ongoing. Whether or not there were going to be actual difficulties at that point, Nelson Mandela was still president. And it seemed like that we were going to have the possibility of shooting in Parliament when Parliament was not in session. There was, among the Black South Africans that I met at the time, there was a great deal of excitement and pleasure at the knowledge that the story was going to be told for American television, and people were hoping that the film would be released in South Africa at some point. Among white South Africans that I met at that time, there was excitement and cooperation, but there was something else that was going on. Access to jobs. In order for that South African crew to be put together, one would have expected that there would be Black South African filmmakers involved. Well, certainly we knew that, Joe Sargent, he's the director, he's an American. So, okay, but, what about the electricians? What about some of the other technical staff that would be involved, the sound engineers, even the people holding the microphones, grips, and other crew that was going to be involved. It seemed as though that was where there was a lot of tension. There was an expectation that some of those people would be Black, if not the majority. But some. There was resistance to even the idea of some. Some seem to imply that you're going to force us to take less qualified people for these jobs. So I do recall that. I do recall some resistance there. I remember words like affirmative action and used in a very derisive tone. I remember that was floating around in the background. It was an awkward situation for the network people at Showtime. They weren't quite sure how to handle it. Most of their initial contacts in the South African filmmaking arena were with white South Africans who had long been established. But those second and third level positions where there were openings, the question was, are Black South Africans going to get those opportunities? Will there be a recognition that we're telling the story of Nelson Mandela and the struggle that he had, that he engaged in order to bring justice and equality into the South African society, the creation of this new country, RSA, then how do you reconcile that with this elbowing and pushing and shoving and jostling and resistance on just over these small jobs on this lower level? It can't be an entirely white crew shooting the life of Nelson Mandela while Nelson Mandela is alive and well
I suppose as South Africans, there's a sense of ownership
Yes, of course.
of Madiba. And I think for, with the numerous films and books and documentaries that have come out tracing his life and the life of Winnie Mandela, there's been a sense in the creative industry that these projects go to foreign production companies, the creatives, or I guess the artists that are attached to it. So, people like Morgan Freeman, Idris Elba, Sidney Poitier, Terrence Howard, American Hollywood stars, to the detriment of the growth of the South African film industry, in the sense that it's not promoting its own artists, and the belief that it's not going to be a successful project unless it's attached to a big Hollywood name like that. And so I suppose there has always been that distrust. And I think when I was reading up about Long Walk to Freedom and Mandela and De Klerk and some of the other films that were in the works, that some of the unions were protesting and against, I want to say, the outsourcing of our stories and the talent to tell these stories and put these stories together. Did you understand that frustration, or did you experience it at that time, or was it later on, as you say, when you came back?
At the time that I was actually there in pre-production, no, I did not. I did not experience a lot of negativity. I do remember some skepticism.
Mm-hmm.
But it was not on the part of the Black South Africans who I met. The skepticism, I think, was on the part of the white South Africans I met at the time. Who are these Americans who are coming, and what are they getting ready to say about South Africa, about whites in South Africa? Are we all going to be villains? And are they coming in and are they going to, be, ugly Americans and simply just take over and just elbow their way through everything, tell everyone what to do and, throw their weight around, and then get on their planes and fly away? Yeah, I remember sensing some of that. To your point about propriety and ownership and representation, I think that is very important and remains important. I look forward to a point in which South African filmmakers themselves will take charge, will take over these stories, no matter how much material I had access to, no matter how many people I spoke to, and no matter how many people were open to me, inviting me into their homes and taking me around and showing me things. I am not South African. I cannot tell that story the way someone born and raised on South African soil can tell it. I cannot, tell it the way someone who, and certainly the young filmmakers of today, they have no more recollection of that past history than most Americans right now.
Did you worry about or the authenticity aspect of it then? I see you acknowledge that part. Did it ever factor into your thinking pre or post the film itself?
Pre, during, and post. Yes, I was very much aware of it. I am, a child of the Black arts movement here in the United States. So I know, what it is, to be very much aware of the importance of authenticity, representation. I know what it is to have a certain proprietary sense or feeling about the history of, my people here. And so if someone from, overseas wants to come to America and suddenly do a film on, the story of Martin Luther King or Malcolm X, I'm going to say, why are you doing it? How come you didn't talk to me? Why am I not being hired to tell this story?
Did you, post Mandela and De Klerk, did you get a chance to watch any of the other movies, Invictus, Winnie, Long Walk to Freedom, and experience a sense of, what's the word? Not envy so much, but I mean, because, we talk about these big budget films now. That film purportedly was made and sold for millions and millions and millions of dollars. Did you look back?
Yeah. Yes, you always do.
Yeah.
Mandela and De Klerk was constrained by budget, and I wish we did have that feature film budget that Long Walk to Freedom was able to attain, or some of the other films. But at the same time, for what we were trying to do, I feel very proud, and I don't necessarily feel envious of the others. I just wish we had the same budget. I believe we could have, and as I said earlier, with a larger budget and perhaps with a different sensibility on the part of the network, we could have achieved a great deal more had we been able to do a mini series as opposed to trying to squeeze everything into a 2-hour motion picture.
And maybe a bit more time too.
Yes, it's the scope of these stories. Nelson Mandela's, the true film biography of him, if it is to be a motion picture, is going to be a huge epic on the scale of something like Gandhi. The Gandhi picture is going to have to be close to 3 hours in length. It's going to have to sweep across vast landscapes, or if it's repeated as a television experience, it's going to have to be a multi-part. You cannot talk about Nelson Mandela, as I said, unless you talk about Oliver Tambo, and you cannot talk about Oliver Tambo unless you're prepared to talk about Walter Sisulu, and you cannot talk about Walter Sisulu, Oliver Tambo, or Nelson Mandela unless you give broad space to the women in their lives, because their wives were the ones who held down the fort in the townships while these men were in prison or in exile. The families they left behind had to survive, and that is a major story in terms of what those families had to endure.
And what sustained them.
And what sustained them, because what sustained them also has gone into sustaining the character of the country itself. So when these stories are spoken from a South African perspective with 100% South African voices, it's going to be entirely different than the models that we see right now.
And the Hollywood treatment.
The Hollywood treatment, yeah. It'll be something entirely different when you're using, a South African sensibility and it's shot in South Africa. True. By South Africans.
I think like when Long Walk to Freedom was finally released, I can't believe it was released, 12 years ago now? I seem to remember being at a press conference at the Mandela Foundation head offices here in Houghton, and Anand Singh, the producer, Justin Chadwick, the director, and Idris Elba were there. I think like when I look back and think of the reception to the film, that it was a bit underwhelming for a film that had been, much hyped and vaunted for many years leading up to it. Because, I mean, for that kind of scope and that kind of budget and that kind of cast, I think the expectations for what it would become were not met. But that's just like that's my assessment of it. I don't want to speak for everybody, but I think the expectations were a bit higher and maybe the film itself flattered to deceive. Richard, no, you've been more than generous with your time. I just want to say thank you very much for just the reflections on not only South African history, but just the industry itself, film industry, and some very lovely anecdotes and memories. So I appreciate your time. Hopefully we'll get to speak again pretty soon. But I just really, really appreciate your time. And
you're most welcome.
If you're hearing this, you've reached the end of this episode. I would like to believe it means you've enjoyed it. So, Ngiyabonga, thank you very much for that. I would also love to hear your feedback on this episode and suggestions for possible future episodes. So please reach out via email or Instagram or Twitter, whichever you prefer. My handles and my addresses are all on the show notes. And as a last note, please subscribe to this show. Rate it. 5 stars, nothing less, please. And of course, share it on your own platforms. I would love to hear back from you, and I would love to get the show going.